So we'll continue our discussion of business history. We're now going to talk about the progressive era, the progressive movement. Press hard with these pens. So the progressive era starts around the turn of the 20th century and basically says that if you can institute social reform, that's not only a good thing for business, but that's also a good thing for society. And progressivism is similar to populism, but it's a little bit more moderate and had a little bit wider appeal. And it was actually a real mainstream doctrine that had a lot of reforms that we still see today. They thought, and one of their main principles, in contrast to the populists, was that they thought social ills could be cured by having government intervene to curb the abuses of big business. And the progressive really has quite a few successes. They broke up a lot of the trusts and monopolies. Standard Oil, for example, was broken up. They outlawed campaign contributions by corporations, although corporations have found a way around that. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this course. They restricted child labor. This is huge. In industrializing America, children were used quite a bit in factories. And you think about it. You got a small hand, it can fit into a small machine to fix it, but unfortunately those small hands would get stuck in machines and they get torn off. So there were a lot of workplace injuries involving children. Of course, children weren't going to school too if they were working. So the progressives worked to restrict and eventually outlaw child labor. They were the ones that passed the corporate income tax. And they also began regulation of food and drug companies as well as public utilities. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in this course. Okay? Another movement that actually is a little bit older than the progressives is the socialists. We'll also talk about the communists. Okay. So, socialism basically means that in some vague way, a country's government has an obligation to its citizens. I have been all over the world. I am yet to find a country that does not have some aspect of socialism in it. And let's just think about, and I'll use the U.S. as an example. Here in the U.S., what do we have? We have free public education up through high school. We have public universities. Yes, you have to pay, but they are still subsidized by the government. We have things like Social Security. We have welfare, unemployment insurance, Medicare and Medicaid. So we have all sorts of little bits and pieces of socialism, even though we don't define ourselves as a socialist country. And you would find little things like this everywhere you go. The idea that socialism rejects the ideas of capitalism, I think, is nonsense. It's more of a supplement to capitalism to make sure that capitalism works maybe more fairly, gives everyone a more equal chance. As my friends in France would say, it's capitalism with a conscience. Now, socialism is quite an old movement. It's generally seen as having started with Babeuf, who lived during the late 1700s, and he generally thought that we should seize the possessions of the wealthy and give them to the masses. However, later socialist thinkers, particularly in England, kind of used Judeo-Christian values to justify government intervention in markets to make sure that everyone had an equal chance. So it's not necessarily a revolutionary doctrine per se, even though that may have been Babeuf's original intention. Now, a more extreme form of socialism that most of us have heard of is communism. And communism basically, at least according to Marx, basically says that the story of history is nothing more than class struggle. And using the dominance model, they would advocate a revolution where you would flip that triangle of the dominance model on its head, squash the power elite, power elite are what we'd call the 1%ers. Those are the people that call all the shots in the areas of business, like CEOs, government, politicians, presidents, etc., and society, kind of those wealthy individuals that are able to call the shots and make their own rules in society. So the communists advocated taking power from the power elite and redistributing all of their property and their wealth equally among others. And they had what they called the dictatorship of the proletariat. If you're interested in this, I have some videos on the Communist Manifesto, and we can talk more about that during those videos. But what you need to know right now is that they advocate taking power from the 1%ers. Now, the Socialists, though, in the United States, we didn't have much of a communist party here in the U.S., but we did have a relatively strong socialist party that kind of petered out around the 1900s. And they arose because, again, for the same reason that progressives were successful. People didn't like the widespread child labor. There were a lot of factory accidents, which were hurting and wearing down factory workers. Wealth and power were concentrated in the hands of a select few in the United States, and that's both individual and corporate wealth. And the amount of inequality between the rich and the poor seemed unfair and unnecessary. Furthermore, socialists had a lot of success because every time there was an economic collapse, it seemed that the masses suffered in a disproportionate manner that was certainly considered unfair. And the industrial growth that was occurring also created a new, what we would call a precariat. Those were factory workers who were dependent on day-to-day work, and so they were kind of downtrodden by society. So the Socialist Party arose to represent those individuals who could not represent themselves, but also had a very precarious quality of life. The Socialists also worked to make unionization more widespread. Previously, unions were tied to individual companies. Under the Socialist era, unions actually wound up becoming national. 1869, you have the Knights of Labor being set up. In 1886, the American Federation of Labor was formed. In 1887, you start having strikes. In 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World starts. And then, of course, in 1912, that's the real height of the socialist movement in the United States. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk a little bit about business history from World War II up through kind of the Vietnam War era, and I'm hoping to see you then.